before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. The piercing sound of sirens echoed down the narrow street, growing louder by the second. Rebecca stood motionless in her tiny living room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, her modest home was drenched in the glow of red and blue flashing lights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She could hear her neighbors murmuring outside, their hushed voices filled with curiosity and suspicion. 7 police cars had pulled up outside her small, weathered house. Doors opened in unison, and officers began to step out, their faces set with unreadable expressions. The lead officer reached for his radio as others approached the front steps. Rebecca clutched the edge of the wooden table for support, her knuckles turning white. What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced toward the photo of her and her mother on the mantel, a reminder of the life she fought so hard to hold together. Fear tightened its grip on her as the sound of boots on her porch made her stomach churn. She moved slowly to the door, her legs feeling like lead. The knocking was sharp, authoritative, and sent a jolt through her spine. "Rebecca Miller," a voice called from the other side. She hesitated, her mind racing. What could they want with her? Her world narrowed to that single moment. The door, the lights, the faces watching from the shadows outside. Rebecca, a humble girl with more burdens than blessings, had no idea what was coming. A day that had begun like any other was about to spiral into chaos. The night before, the rain had fallen in relentless sheets, soaking everything in its path. Rebecca was returning home from her candy stand, clutching her meager earnings in a small box. The chill of the storm seeped into her bones as she trudged along the deserted road. Ahead, the faint glow of headlights pierced the downpour. A sleek black car skidded dangerously on the wet curve, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Rebecca froze as the car lost control, veering off the road and slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. Her breath caught. "Oh no," she whispered, her instincts kicking in. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the wreckage, her shoes splashing through muddy puddles. The front of the car was crumpled, smoke curling from the hood. Inside, a man slumped against the steering wheel, unconscious. Rebecca tugged at the car door, her small frame straining against the weight. "Come on," she cried, her voice drowned out by the storm. With a final pull, the door groaned open. The man, a distinguished-looking figure in an expensive suit, was bleeding from a gash on his forehead. She shook his shoulder urgently. "Sir, wake up. Please, you have to get out." When he didn't respond, Rebecca reached for his seatbelt, her hands trembling. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to unbuckle it and pull him free. Rain mixed with sweat and tears as she dragged him to safety, collapsing on the ground beside him. She gasped for air, her own body aching from the effort. The man's eyelids fluttered, and he let out a faint groan. Relief washed over her. She had saved him, this stranger in need, without a second thought. Little did she know that this moment of bravery would soon bring unimaginable consequences. Rebecca's thoughts snapped back to the present as the knock on her door came again. Harder this time. "Rebecca Miller, we need to speak with you," the voice outside demanded. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. The faces of the officers outside were partially obscured by the glare of their headlights and the rain-smeared glass. Her legs felt weak, and she struggled to steady her breathing. What could they want? She had never been in trouble before. Steeling herself, Rebecca opened the door, the old hinges groaning in protest. The sight of the uniformed officers standing on her porch made her heart sink further. Their serious expressions filled her with dread. The lead officer stepped forward, his face shadowed by the brim of his cap. "Are you Rebecca Miller?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the muffled whispers of the crowd gathering outside. She clutched the doorframe for support. "What's this about?" "We need to ask you some questions regarding an incident that occurred last night," he said. Rebecca's eyes widened, her mind flashing back to the car crash and the man she had saved. Was this about him? Had something happened to him? As if reading her thoughts, The officer gestured to one of his colleagues, who stepped forward holding a clipboard. "You're going to need to come with us," he said. Her stomach dropped. The words hit her like a hammer. "Why?" she stammered, glancing between the officers. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officers exchanged a look, their faces unreadable. "You'll have a chance to explain," one of them said. Rebecca's world began to spin. Her selflessness, the act she had been so proud of, was now being called into question in ways she never could have imagined. Rebecca's life had always been a delicate balancing act, one she performed with unwavering determination. At just 11 years old, she had taken on responsibilities far beyond her years. Her mother's illness had left her bedridden, and their home, a small one-bedroom house with peeling paint and creaking floors, reflected the weight of their struggles. The day always began the same for Rebecca. She would wake up early, quietly making her way to the kitchen to prepare her mother's medication. The cluttered counter held bottles of pills and a list of instructions scribbled in her mother's shaky handwriting. Rebecca studied it carefully, double-checking each dose before carrying the tray to her mother's room. "Good morning, Mama," she said softly, placing the tray on the bedside table. Her mother, pale and frail, smiled weakly. "Good morning, sweetheart," her mother replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. She watched as her mother swallowed the pills, each one seeming like a small battle. Rebecca forced herself to smile, though her heart ached seeing her mother in such a fragile state. Once her mother was settled, Rebecca moved to the table in the corner of their cramped living room, where she kept her savings. The small tin box held coins and crumpled bills she had earned from selling candies on the street. She counted them carefully, whispering numbers under her breath. Her hands stilled as she reached the total. Still not enough. With a sigh, she placed the box back under the loose floorboard. Every penny was meant for her mother's surgery, but the goal seemed further away with each passing day. Rebecca glanced at the clock. It was time to set up her candy stand, a task that felt both hopeful and hopeless. Rebecca's mother, Margaret, had always been her guiding star, even in the toughest of times. Despite her illness, Margaret's love and wisdom were the anchors that kept Rebecca grounded. That evening, as Rebecca returned home from selling candies, she found her mother awake, waiting for her in their small living room. The dim glow of a single lamp highlighted Margaret's warm but tired smile. Rebecca set down her bag and sat beside her mother on the worn couch. "How was today, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Rebecca hesitated. She didn't want to burden her mother with the truth, that the day had been slow, and she had barely made enough to cover their daily expenses. "It was fine, Mama," she said instead, offering a reassuring smile. Margaret reached out and cupped her daughter's face with a frail hand. "You work so hard, Rebecca. Too hard for someone your age." "I don't mind," Rebecca said earnestly. "You're all I have, Mama. I'll do whatever it takes to make you better." Her mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You've already done more than enough, my sweet girl. I wish I could take some of this burden off your shoulders." Rebecca shook her head. "No, Mama. Can handle it. And someday, I'll have enough saved to pay for your surgery. You'll see." The room fell silent, filled only with the faint hum of the rain outside. Rebecca leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, drawing comfort from her presence. They didn't need words. Their bond was a source of strength, unspoken but deeply felt. But as Rebecca sat there, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought in the back of her mind. Time was running out, and her mother's condition was getting worse. The next morning, Rebecca woke early, her heart heavy with the weight of their reality. She moved quietly through their cramped home, careful not to wake her mother. The peeling wallpaper and threadbare furniture were reminders of how little they had, but she didn't let herself dwell on it. Rebecca's candy stand was modest, just an old wooden crate with a colorful cloth draped over it. She had arranged small jars of brightly wrapped candies on top, hoping the vibrant colors would catch the eyes of passers-by. Her stand was positioned near the busiest part of town, where she'd call out to potential customers with a warm smile. "Candies. "Sweet treats for just a penny," she would sing, her voice filled with enthusiasm. Children often lingered, their eyes wide with longing, while parents hesitated, debating if they could spare the change. Despite the occasional sale, Rebecca's earnings were painfully slow. She kept a mental tally of every coin she made, imagining it bringing her closer to her mother's surgery. But today there were fewer customers than usual. The overcast sky and intermittent drizzle kept people indoors. Rebecca's optimism faltered as she stared at her nearly untouched jars of candy. By the time she packed up her stand that evening, her savings for the day were meager. As she walked home, her thoughts spiraled. Her mother's surgery wasn't just a dream. It was a necessity. Without it, there was no guarantee her mother would survive much longer. Rebecca paused at their front door, clutching her tin box tightly. Inside was every penny she had earned, each coin representing hours of hard work and unwavering hope. She glanced back at the darkening sky, whispering a silent prayer. The stakes were higher than ever, and Rebecca knew she couldn't afford to fail. That evening, as Rebecca made her way home, the weather took a sudden turn. The drizzle from earlier in the day had grown into a torrential downpour. The streets were slick, and the dim streetlights barely pierced through the rain. Rebecca pulled her threadbare coat tighter around herself and quickened her pace, eager to reach the safety of home. She clutched her candy tin against her chest, protecting it from the rain. The sound of her hurried footsteps was drowned out by the rhythmic patter of raindrops. As she reached a bend in the road, something caught her attention, a pair of headlights swerving erratically. Her heart leapt as she saw the sleek black car speeding toward the curve. The driver was struggling to control the vehicle, the tires screeching as they skidded on the wet road. "No, no, no," Rebecca whispered, frozen in place. The car spun wildly, veering off the road and slamming into a tree with a deafening crash. The impact sent a shudder through the air, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the relentless rain. Rebecca's breath caught. Instinctively, she ran toward the wreckage, her candy tin slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground, spilling its contents. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the car. The front was crumpled, and smoke was rising from the hood. "Help! Somebody please help," she screamed, but the road was deserted. The rain continued to pour, soaking her completely. Without waiting for anyone to arrive, Rebecca moved closer, determined to do whatever she could. The closer Rebecca got to the wrecked car, the more her determination drowned out her fear. Smoke billowed from the engine, mixing with the rain to create a suffocating haze. Through the cracked windshield, she could see the driver, a man slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. "Sir, can you hear me?" Rebecca shouted, her voice cracking as the rain stung her face. She yanked on the driver's door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her small hands slipped on the wet metal, and frustration surged within her. Glancing around desperately, she spotted a large branch nearby and grabbed it. With all her strength, she used it to pry open the door. The door creaked and groaned before finally giving way. The man inside was unconscious, a stream of blood trickling down his temple. Rebecca's heart raced as she leaned in, carefully unbuckling his seatbelt. His tailored suit and gold watch caught her attention briefly, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. "Come on, stay with me," she muttered, slipping her arms under his and tugging with all her might. The man was heavy, and her soaked clothes made every movement a struggle, but she refused to give up. With one final heave, she pulled him free of the car and dragged him a safe distance away. She collapsed onto the wet ground beside him, gasping for breath. The rain plastered her hair to her face as she checked for signs of life. The man's chest rose and fell faintly, and a weak groan escaped his lips. Relief washed over her, but the sound of hissing from the car's engine snapped her back to reality. Smoke was now pouring out in thick clouds. Rebecca scrambled to her feet, ignoring the ache in her muscles. "I need to get help," she said aloud, her voice trembling. She looked down at the man, hoping he could hold on just a little longer. But as she turned to head for help, she noticed something. Her candy tin, her day's earnings, had been swept away by the rain. Coins and candies floated in the rushing water pooling by the roadside. Her chest tightened, but she shook her head. It didn't matter. The man's life was more important. Without hesitation, she sprinted down the road, shouting for someone, anyone, to come and help. By the time Rebecca returned with help, the scene was chaotic. A tow truck had arrived to handle the wrecked car, and paramedics were loading the injured man onto a stretcher. Rebecca stood at the edge of the commotion, soaked to the bone, her clothes caked in mud. No one paid her much attention as they worked quickly to stabilize the man. She watched as the ambulance doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped off into the night, its siren wailing. Relief flooded her. He was alive and he was getting the care he needed. But as the crowd dispersed, the reality of her situation began to sink in. Her candy tin was gone, washed away in the rain. All the money she had painstakingly saved for her mother's surgery had disappeared in an instant. Rebecca's stomach churned as she stared at the spot where the tin had been. Weeks of hard work reduced to nothing. She sank to her knees, the weight of the moment crushing her. "What am I going to do now?" she whispered, her voice lost in the sound of the rain. When the tow truck driver finally approached her, he gave her a strange look. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his gruff voice tinged with concern. Rebecca nodded mechanically, not trusting herself to speak. She picked herself up and trudged home, her feet dragging with each step. The storm had finally begun to let up, but inside, Rebecca felt as though she was still caught in its grip. As she reached her house, her mother's face appeared in the window, pale with worry. Rebecca forced a smile and waved, determined to hide her despair. She couldn't let her mother know what had happened. Not yet. For now, all she could do was cling to the hope that somehow, things would get better. Little did she know, this night was only the beginning of a storm far greater than the one she had just endured. The next morning, Rebecca awoke to the sound of heavy knocking on the door. She rubbed her eyes, still groggy from the events of the previous night. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and her mother's worried voice called from the bedroom. "Rebecca, who's at the door?" "I'll check, Mama," she replied, slipping on her shoes and tying her hair into a quick braid. When she opened the door, the sight froze her in place. 7 police cars lined the street outside her home, their flashing lights illuminating the early morning fog. Neighbors peeked out from their windows and whispered among themselves. A tall officer stood at her door, flanked by 2 others. His stern expression made her stomach twist. "Rebecca Miller?" he asked. "Yes," she said hesitantly. "What's going on?" The officer stepped forward. "You're under arrest for suspicion of endangerment and attempted theft." The words hit her like a thunderclap. "What?" she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I didn't do anything." Before she could finish, another officer gently took her by the arm and began guiding her away from the door. Her protests grew louder. "Wait, please. There's been a mistake," Rebecca cried, her voice cracking. Her mother appeared in the doorway, clutching the frame for support. "What's happening?" "Rebecca." "Mama, it's okay," Rebecca shouted, though tears streamed down her face. "I'll figure this out, I promise." The officers ignored her pleas and placed her in the back of one of the police cars. As the door closed, Rebecca caught a glimpse of her mother collapsing into a chair, her frail body racked with sobs. Rebecca felt her heart breaking. All she had done was try to save a man's life, and now she was being treated like a criminal. The ride to the police station was silent except for Rebecca's quiet sobs. She stared out the window, her mind racing. How could this be happening? What had she done to deserve this? When the car pulled up to the station, the officers escorted her inside. The stark white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights only added to her growing sense of dread. Rebecca was led to an interrogation room, where she was told to sit and wait. After what felt like hours, the door opened, and a sharply dressed woman entered. Her high heels clicked against the tiled floor, and her cold eyes bore into Rebecca like daggers. "I'm Victoria Hayes," the woman said, dropping a folder onto the table. My father is the man you supposedly saved last night. Rebecca blinked, confused. I didn't supposedly save him. I pulled him out of the car. He was unconscious. Victoria cut her off with a sharp laugh. Oh, spare me the sob story. You expect me to believe that a girl like you, someone with nothing, just happened to stumble across my father's car and decided to help out of the goodness of your heart? Rebecca's cheeks burned with indignation. That's exactly what happened, she said firmly. I didn't take anything. I didn't do anything wrong. Victoria leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the table. The police found my father's wallet missing. His watch. And you were the only one at the scene. So tell me, Rebecca, where is it? Rebecca's jaw dropped. I didn't take anything. I wouldn't. Enough. Victoria snapped. People like you are all the same. You saw an opportunity and took it. But let me make this clear. You messed with the wrong family. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes as Victoria stood and signaled for the officers to take her away. Please, you have to believe me. I didn't steal anything, she pleaded as they led her to a holding cell. The cell was cold and barren, a single bench the only furniture. Rebecca sat down, hugging her knees to her chest. The weight of Victoria's accusations pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. How had her selflessness turned into this nightmare? Meanwhile, in a private hospital room across town, Robert Hayes slowly regained consciousness. The steady beeping of monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air. He blinked, trying to focus his vision. His head throbbed, and his memories were a jumbled blur. Where am I? He murmured weakly. A nurse leaned over him, adjusting the 4 in his arm. You're in the hospital, Mr. Hayes. You were in an accident, but you're stable now. Try not to move too much. Robert's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the crash. The rain, the curve, the impact, and then, a face. A young girl. She was there. She had pulled him from the wreckage. She saved me, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Pardon, the nurse asked, leaning closer. There was a girl, Robert said, his voice gaining strength. She saved my life. The nurse offered him a puzzled look. I'm not sure about that, sir. The police report didn't mention anyone else. Robert frowned, struggling to sit up despite the nurse's protests. No, I remember her. She was young, wet from the rain. She risked her life to pull me out of the car. The nurse gently eased him back onto the bed. You need rest, Mr. Hayes. Maybe your family can fill in the details when they visit. Robert's brow furrowed as a deep sense of unease settled over him. Something wasn't right. If the girl had saved him, why wasn't she being acknowledged? He closed his eyes, determined to find answers once he was strong enough. Little did he know. His daughter's actions were already setting events into motion that would change everything. Days passed, and Robert's health improved enough for him to sit up in bed and speak with more clarity. Yet, the nagging memory of the girl who had saved him wouldn't leave his mind. Each time Victoria visited, she seemed evasive when he brought it up. Victoria, Robert said one morning, his voice steady. Where is the girl who saved me? I need to thank her. Victoria pursed her lips, pretending to adjust his pillows. Dad, you're still recovering. You shouldn't worry about things like that. I'm not asking about my recovery. I'm asking about her, Robert said, narrowing his eyes. I remember her clearly. What's going on? Victoria's feigned patience snapped. Dad, she's a fraud. The police arrested her because she stole from you during the accident. Robert stared at his daughter in disbelief. That's impossible. She pulled me out of the car. She didn't steal anything, she saved my life. She saw an opportunity and she took it, Victoria insisted, her voice cold. I'm protecting you from being taken advantage of. Robert's chest tightened. He had raised Victoria to be strong and assertive, but this was cruelty. And worse, he could see that she truly believed what she was saying. I can't let this stand, Robert said firmly. Ignoring Victoria's protests, he pushed himself out of bed, wincing at the sharp pain in his ribs. "Dad, what are you doing? You can't just leave." "Watch me," Robert replied, his resolve unshakable. He managed to dress himself with some difficulty and limped toward the door. The hospital staff tried to stop him, but Robert refused to be swayed. He hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the police station. The girl had saved his life. Now it was time to save hers. Robert arrived at the police station, his heart pounding from both exertion and anticipation. The sight of Rebecca behind bars, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, sent a pang of guilt through him. She looked even younger and more vulnerable than he had remembered. He approached the front desk, ignoring the pain in his side. "I need to speak with someone about the girl you've detained. Her name is Rebecca Miller." The officer behind the desk raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Robert Hayes." "I'm the man she saved," Robert said, his voice sharp and commanding. "And I'm here to clear her name." The officer's demeanor shifted immediately. "Mr. Hayes, we were told she's a suspect in a theft case. Your wallet and watch were reported missing." Robert slammed his palm on the counter, startling everyone nearby. "That's absurd. I don't care what was reported. She didn't steal from me. She risked her life to save mine." The commotion drew Victoria, who had just arrived after hearing of her father's escape from the hospital. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "Exactly what I should have done the moment I woke up," Robert shot back. "Undoing this horrible mistake." Victoria's face reddened. "She's lying, Dad. The evidence." "Enough, Victoria," Robert interrupted, his voice rising. "You weren't there. She didn't take anything from me. If anything's missing, it's because of the accident, not her." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the lead officer spoke. "Mr. Hayes, if you're certain of this, we'll need your formal statement to proceed." "Get me the paperwork," Robert said firmly. "And release her. Now." Moments later, the sound of keys jangling filled the room. Rebecca looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion as the cell door opened. "You're free to go," an officer said gently. Rebecca stepped out hesitantly, her eyes meeting Robert's. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came back for me." Robert nodded, his gaze softening. "You saved me, Rebecca. Now it's my turn to do the same for you." Rebecca's legs felt weak as she stepped out of the holding cell. The world outside the bars seemed surreal after the nightmare she had endured. She couldn't stop trembling, her emotions a turbulent mix of relief, gratitude, and lingering fear. Robert approached her carefully, his expression one of both apology and admiration. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry this happened to you. If I had known." "You believed me," Rebecca interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Course I did. You saved my life. No one else believed in you, but I knew the truth." Victoria, standing nearby, folded her arms and glared. "Dad, you're being naive. Just because she saved you doesn't mean she's innocent." "Stop it, Victoria," Robert snapped, turning toward his daughter with an intensity that made her flinch. "You let your assumptions blind you to what really happened. This girl deserves our gratitude, not our suspicion." For a moment the room fell silent. Rebecca looked down at her hands, feeling torn between relief and the weight of what awaited her at home. "I need to go," Rebecca said softly. "My mother, she's not well. I've already lost so much time." Robert frowned. "Your mother. Is she all right?" Rebecca shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "She's sick. I was saving money for her surgery, but it's all gone now. I don't know what to do." Robert's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. She had been through so much, yet her first thought was of her mother. He turned to the officers. "I'll handle the formalities. Can someone give us a ride? This girl has been through enough." Moments later, Rebecca and Robert were seated in a car bound for her home. Rebecca clutched her hands tightly, silently praying that her mother was still holding on. When they arrived, Rebecca ran to the house, her heart pounding. Her mother was lying on the couch, her breathing shallow but steady. Rebecca knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "Mama, I'm here," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry I wasn't with you sooner." Margaret opened her eyes weakly and smiled. "Rebecca, you're safe." Robert stood in the doorway, watching the scene quietly. He resolved then and there to do everything in his power to help this girl who had risked everything to save him. Rebecca stayed by her mother's side, holding her frail hand as tears streamed down her face. Her mother's breathing was shallow, and her pallor frightened her more than words could express. "She needs a doctor," Rebecca said desperately, looking over her shoulder at Robert. Robert nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll arrange for an ambulance." "No, we can't wait," Rebecca insisted, her voice trembling. "She might not make it." Robert hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "I'll take you both myself." He moved quickly, helping Margaret into his car while Rebecca followed, holding her mother's head steady and murmuring soft reassurances. The drive to the hospital was tense, every second feeling like an eternity. Rebecca clutched her mother's hand tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. "Please hold on, Mama," she pleaded. Robert drove with a singular focus, his jaw set and hands gripping the wheel tightly. He stole a glance at Rebecca in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear but also fierce determination. When they reached the hospital, Robert leapt out of the car and called for assistance. Nurses and doctors appeared with a stretcher, swiftly wheeling Margaret inside. Rebecca tried to follow, but the staff stopped her at the doors. "You'll have to wait here," one of the nurses said gently. Rebecca's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto a chair in the waiting area. Robert sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She'll be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. Rebecca nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had to believe it. There was no other choice. The waiting room was suffocatingly quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights doing nothing to calm Rebecca's frayed nerves. She sat hunched forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though sheer willpower could bring good news. Robert sat beside her, watching the young girl struggle under the weight of her worry. Her strength and selflessness had been undeniable from the moment he met her, but now he saw something else: exhaustion. She had been fighting battles no child should have to face, and it pained him to see her so defeated. "You've been carrying too much on your own," Robert said gently, breaking the silence. Rebecca glanced at him, her eyes hollow but filled with defiance. "I don't have a choice," she said. "She's my mother. If I don't fight for her, who will?" Her words struck Robert deeply. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he spoke. "You're not alone anymore, Rebecca. I owe you my life, and I intend to repay that debt." Rebecca frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "I don't need anything from you," she said. "Just knowing you believed me is enough." Robert shook his head. "It's not enough. You shouldn't have to scrape by just to keep your mother alive. Let me help you. I'll make sure your mother gets the surgery she needs. And anything else you need, too." Rebecca's eyes widened in shock. You'd do that? For us?" "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," Robert said earnestly. "It's the least I can do." Before Rebecca could respond, the doctor entered the waiting room. Rebecca shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "Your mother is stable for now," the doctor said. "But she'll need surgery as soon as possible." Rebecca's knees nearly gave out from relief, but Robert steadied her. "Doctor," he said firmly, "schedule the surgery. I'll cover all the expenses." Rebecca's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in what felt like forever, a glimmer of hope broke through her despair. After the initial shock of Robert's promise, Rebecca found herself pacing in the hospital corridor. Her mother was stable, and surgery was being scheduled, but her mind refused to settle. The day's whirlwind of events had left her emotionally drained, but also more determined than ever. Robert approached her cautiously. "You should get some rest, Rebecca," he said. "You've been through enough." "I can't rest," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "I've spent every day fighting for her. I can't stop now." Robert admired her resilience, but he couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on her. "You're not in this alone anymore," he reminded her. "I'll make sure your mother gets the care she needs." Rebecca paused, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for believing in me when no one else did." "I should have come sooner," Robert said with a trace of regret. "But I'm here now, and I won't let you down." Rebecca nodded, her resolve firm. "No. But I'm not giving up my part in this. I'll keep selling candies, keep doing whatever it takes to make sure she's okay. I can't sit back and wait for someone else to fix things." Robert smiled faintly, recognizing the fire in her spirit. "That's what makes you extraordinary, Rebecca. But sometimes it's okay to let someone help you." The doctor returned, holding a clipboard. "The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning," he announced. "She's in good hands." Rebecca exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. Turning to Robert, she said, "No matter what happens, I'm not giving up. She's all I have, and I'll fight for her with everything I've got." Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And I'll be right here fighting with you." Rebecca's eyes glistened with emotion, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. The following morning, Rebecca sat outside the operating room, her hands clasped tightly in prayer. Her mother was inside, undergoing the surgery that could save her life. The seconds ticked by painfully, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Robert sat beside her, his presence a quiet source of comfort. He didn't say much, but the occasional reassuring squeeze of her shoulder spoke volumes. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Rebecca asked finally, her voice small and filled with trepidation. "She's stronger than you think," Robert replied, smiling softly. "Just like her daughter." Rebecca smiled faintly, though her stomach remained tied in knots. When the surgeon finally emerged, Rebecca shot to her feet. "How is she?" she asked, her heart hammering in her chest. The doctor smiled warmly. "The surgery was successful. She's stable and resting now." Relief flooded Rebecca's face, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Robert watched as the weight visibly lifted from her shoulders. He couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for this girl who had endured so much and still found the strength to keep going. Hours later, Rebecca sat at her mother's bedside. Margaret was pale but peaceful, her breathing steady. Rebecca brushed a strand of hair from her mother's face, her heart full of gratitude. "You're going to be okay, Mama," she whispered. Robert stood in the doorway, a quiet witness to the tender moment. In that room, hope and healing had finally begun to take root. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca's life began to change in ways she never could have imagined. With her mother recovering well and the weight of medical expenses lifted by Robert's generosity, a sense of stability returned to their lives. But Robert didn't stop at paying for the surgery. He helped Rebecca set up a proper candy business, providing her with a cart and supplies to expand her sales. For the first time, Rebecca's earnings were more than enough to cover their needs, with plenty left over. "I don't know how to thank you," Rebecca told Robert one afternoon as they worked together to paint the new candy cart. "You don't have to," Robert replied with a chuckle. "Just keep being the incredible person you are." Rebecca's smile was radiant. "I'll do my best." Meanwhile, Robert found himself reflecting on the events that had brought them together. His near-death experience had been terrifying, but it had also introduced him to someone who reminded him of the power of selflessness and resilience. For Victoria, the journey had been more complicated. At first, she struggled with guilt over her harsh treatment of Rebecca. But seeing her father's bond with the girl, and witnessing Rebecca's unwavering kindness, softened her heart. Eventually, she apologized to Rebecca, and though it took time, a tentative friendship began to form between them. One crisp autumn morning, Rebecca stood outside her candy stand, greeting customers with her usual bright smile. Business was booming, and her mother, now healthy and strong, often joined her to lend a hand. Robert stopped by, as he often did, with a warm greeting and a cup of hot chocolate for Rebecca. "How's my favorite entrepreneur?" he asked. "Better than ever," Rebecca replied, her grin infectious. As she watched Robert walk away, she thought about how far she had come. The stormy night when she saved his life felt like a distant memory, but the lessons it taught her remained. Rebecca looked out at the bustling street, her heart full of gratitude. She had faced impossible odds and come out stronger on the other side, thanks to her own determination and the kindness of someone she had once called a stranger. Her story had begun in struggle and pain, but it had become a testament to the power of hope, resilience, and the incredible impact of a single act of kindness. And as Rebecca handed a lollipop to a smiling child, she couldn't help but think, sometimes the best way to save yourself is by saving someone else.